This particular bit of land right here for us, next to the town hall, has actually become a significant bit of land for the refugee rights movement as well. This is the 7th time that we've met here in the last 10 weeks to express our dissent and our outrage at the Australian government's policies towards asylum seekers and refugees. Obviously, since the last time we were here, there has been a change in government, and this is actually the first time that we're here in direct opposition to the Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison's Operation Sovereign Borders, the fantastically named Sovereign Borders. And in just the 3 weeks of Tony Abbott's government, we've already seen a few significant changes. We've seen the reintroduction of temporary protection visas, meaning that not only everyone who arrives in Australia past that announcement date, but also the 30,000 people who are living in the community on bridging visas, even once they're determined to be refugees, will never grant permanent protection visas in this country. That means that they will be denied the right for access to mainstream mental health supports. They won't be able to get access to English language lessons, and they'll never have the opportunity to apply for their family to be reunited with them here in Australia. Not only that, we've also seen some tragedy on the sea. Obviously yesterday, I'm sure most of you are aware that a boat sunk off the coast of Indonesia. We're not sure exactly how many people passed away, but it's upwards of 60, most of whom were children. Shame. This is a rally, so if you hear something that you don't like, you can say shame. Yeah. And if you hear something that you like, you can say hear, hear. Like that. Great. The latest reports say that the Australian government was actually notified that that boat was sinking up to 24 hours before the boat went down. So there's a lot of questions to be answered here. We need to hold this government accountable to what's going on, and the only way for us to do that is to keep coming together in moments like this, to share ideas, to talk to each other, to listen to some of the great speakers that we have today, and then to go home and talk to our families and our friends and our colleagues and talk to random strangers on the street. We're mounting against the monolith of the mainstream media, which are going to continue to present this idea that is, only advantageous to political parties. We have to work hard to counter this, and it is a hard job, but it's something that we can do if we keep coming together like this and sharing ideas and talking with each other. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker of the day, who's Irene Doubtney, from the Greens Councillor for City of Sydney. I welcome you up to the stage.
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land, on Gadigal land, land that was never ceded, sold or given away. I pay my respects to the elders past and present. This is Aboriginal land, always was and always will be. I'd like to thank the Refugee Action Coalition for inviting me to speak today, and for continuing to stand up against the disgusting policies of the Australian government and over their treatment of these desperate asylum seekers. If we thought it was bad under the Labor government, the country has reached new lows in electing this Liberal government with its inhumane policies and total lack of transparency. We are rapidly heading for a state of incredible secrecy that will hide the treatment of innocent refugees, transporting them to unknown places in the dead of night. After screaming about the attacks on our borders and the never-ending stream of boat smugglers, this dangerous coalition government has gone from overkill to total secrecy. We shouldn't be surprised, though, as this is the same coalition-style government that sent the army into the Northern Territory Aboriginal communities to enforce the Northern Territory intervention, and it is typical that the military is also their preferred solution for dealing with the most vulnerable people fleeing from war and persecution. These techniques of secrecy and militarism are profoundly disturbing and are reminiscent of the sort of regimes that stink of totalitarianism and inhumanity. The sort of secrecy that the Abbott government is introducing is anathema to a freedom-loving democracy, and it must be resisted at all costs. If we stand by and allow one vulnerable group to be disappeared like this, we head for a path where other vulnerable groups will face the same situation. They'll be made invisible, with their treatment hidden behind a veil of secrecy. Consider the plight of the homeless and those in housing stress. Abbott doesn't even appoint a federal housing minister. We are cursed. We are cursed with a government that cares little for social justice and human rights. It is inconceivable to people of conscience like us that our successive governments strip asylum seekers of their basic human rights and defy the rulings of the United Nations Conventions on Refugees and on Human Rights. History will condemn us for these violations, and we are duty-bound to say no, not in my name. No, you will not tow back boats to Indonesia that doesn't want to cooperate. No, you will not transport human beings like cattle to concentration camps in remote island. You will not relocate refugees to a poor country that can't support them. No, these will not be done in my name. These actions are against everything we have ever come out on the streets and stood for, and must be exposed at every opportunity. These streets should be brimming with people this afternoon who are outraged at these developments, as this is one issue that we must never stay silent on. Abbott promised during the election to stop the boats on day one if elected, and hypocritically he's doing it by just not telling us that they're here. According to The Guardian, the 10th boat arrived on Friday the 27th, but the general public are blithely ignorant of these facts and of what happened to those people who arrived on those boats. Remember, this is a man who gave his support to a touring billboard that counted down every new boat arrival, but who now has insisted on a veil of silence over all asylum seeker issues. The idea of weekly press briefings reminds me of the Vietnam War years, when journalists were drip-fed US propaganda by the military media team. As usual, it will only be the Greens in federal parliament who will fight to break through this veil of secrecy. And it will be a fight that the Greens at all levels of government will be taking up. It will be essential that this action on the streets will support what battles we have to fight in the Parliament. I hate to use the language of war, of battle, but the next few years will be more draconian than the Howard era if the Abbott government continues with its agenda that strips away the humanity of our social system, such as removing support for Aboriginal legal aid, for the most incarcerated group in society, or dismissing the Climate Commission and all the projects on climate change. This government will make the Labor governments that preceded it look progressive, but we know we need real progressive and humanitarian policies that we need in this age of growing conservatism, austerity and global instability. Earlier this month, the Australian Human Rights Law Centre read out a statement to the United Nations Human Rights Council, which met in Geneva, condemning this government's proposed policies. This statement highlighted the dreadful precedent that the Australian government is setting in terms of the treatment of asylum seekers across the globe by its use of the military to deal with what are human rights issues. One of the most disturbing things that could be hidden by the government's lack of transparency is the fate of boats that sink at sea. and how many people are lost when such incidents occur, as we have just seen happen with 2 boats turned back, at least 20 asylum seekers drowned, mainly children, with up to 70 missing and only 25 rescued before they gave up searching for them for the night, which means they couldn't have survived to the next day. However, it is a hopeful sign that this has been reported and that the media blackout is not as effective as the government would really like. We need to know how many boats are turned back and what fate these refugees face when their boats are returned, or what happens to them if they're not allowed to re-enter into Indonesian waters. All the measures that our recent governments have tried have involved trying to dump our refugee obligations onto poor Pacific neighbours like Timor-Leste, Malaysia, Nauru and Papua New Guinea. We have shown our true colours as a nation, a Pacific bully who will dump its responsibilities on countries that can't afford them. I am almost frozen with outrage at what is being done to these hapless refugees, especially the prospect of forcing them to relocate to Papua New Guinea, a country that is systemically unable to assimilate these men, women and children from totally alien backgrounds into their local tribal culture. Freezing is not an option for me though, and it is action that must be taken. We must continue to come out onto the streets and take every opportunity to say, no, you're not doing this in my name. We must walk towards setting up safe pathways and fast-track processing centres, which would give refugees hope that they will be swiftly assessed and sent to appropriate countries for resettlement. We must end the horror of remote detention centres and the insecurity of temporary protection visas and welcome these displaced and desperate human beings into our country. I thank everyone for coming out today, yet again, to stand up for the humanitarian and compassionate treatment of these poor people who could be any one of us or any of our families, but for the luck that we were born in the lucky country. And what can I say? Sadly, it's not so lucky if you're an asylum seeker. So finally, shame, Abbott, shame, not in my name. Refugees are welcome here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. Okay, just going to remind everybody that this rally is organised by the Refugee Action Coalition. It takes a lot of organisation and time to organise these rallies. We've got a bucket going around, so please donate as generously as you can. Up speaking next, we've got Shokafa Tahiri from the Hazara Youth Perspective. I'm going to invite you up to the stage, Shokafa.
Imagine living in a place where the air is filled with despair, misery, fear, injustice, hopelessness, and suffocation. A place where cry for justice is echoed from every length of its horizon. A place where there is no mercy, not even upon a mother and child, where the birds of freedom are caged, thoughts of flight snatched away, and the slightest glimpse of hope and illumination replaced with terror and fright. What would you do when hopes for protection completely dies and that you have no option but to give up everything in pursuit of safety? Have you ever wondered, living in a world where you are told your existence is a crime solely based on your ethnical identity and that your home be made a graveyard for you? What would you do? Would you stay and wait to be burnt in this fire? Have you ever wondered how it is like to be in a constant dread of a bomb exploding nearby? Being singled out and your fragile body hit with a bullet? And what would you do if you had no choice and were born into such an unforgiving world? Being from a Hazara ethnic group who are from Afghanistan, a large proportion of whom, during the history, are made refugees to countries like Pakistan, Iran, where they have had to endure a century of long oppression in the hands of successive Afghan regimes, namely the Abdurrahman regime, late 1900, where 63% of them was mass murdered, looted, enslaved, and brought on the verge of extinction, and their only crime being their ethnicity and faith. The precedence of persecution and genocide still continues today in the presence of civilized nations, but transferred and inflicted on Hazaras in Pakistan, who are the very people that escaped the genocide back in Afghanistan. The conditions of Hazaras are such that these people are completely marginalized, immobilized in the small vicinity where they are left alone to die, whose demand for protection have been completely ignored by the Pakistani authority. The very people who are selflessly dedicated to education and peace are suffocated and paralyzed with fear. Some of them endure it, others run away and jump on a leaky boat, a journey towards safety, because there is still faith in the light at the end of the tunnel, and so hope is instilled at the core of their innocent hearts. To give up everything and pursue a sea journey as it is nothing compared to what they've seen in their own homes. In the recent boat tragedy, the deaths at sea in pursuit of security is tragic. But what is more tragic is Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison's tactics to deter these people from knocking on our doors. Introduction of Operation Sovereign Borders, putting Australian Defence Force in charge of asylum border arrivals, treating them as a national threat. Reintroducing the temporary protection visas, TPVs, the revival of an extreme form of John Howard's policy, to which my father was subjected to as well for about 5 years, whose spirit was completely broken as a result. TPVs mean putting those 30,000 asylum seekers currently living in the community who are scarred with memories of persecution and who are faced with a future of uncertainty as a result, with a life in limbo, who will be deprived of family reunion and travel, and ultimately degraded and disdained in the most tragic way. Expansion of regional detention centers like Nauru, the mental illness factories, while Labour's PNG deal is still in place, means proliferation of cruelty. Who will be held accountable for increasing suicide rates among the asylum seekers and their self-harm? And most disgracefully, Abbott's cruel intention of abolishment of judicial review, where asylum seekers' fate will be left upon the mercy of a single case officer. This will mean we'll be the first developed nation in the world to have snatched away the right of legal appeal from the most vulnerable, the refugees. At the other side of the world, where war has brought humanity to the edge, have we drifted so distant from humanity and moral compass that we are willingly ignoring the plight of a mother, a child, a father, a sibling who are pleadingly knocking on our door for safety? Not only are these policies deliberately departing Australia from the United Nations Convention that we signed up willingly and voluntarily, not only are these policies pushing us robustly back to a third world country, but in these policies that are stemming hatred, stereotypes, intolerance, division, segregation, and misconceptions in the Australian public. It is through these policies that Australian publics are being manipulated to see asylum seekers and border arrivals as a threat, as illegals. It is indeed these policies, that political greed, that commodifies the most desperate and vulnerable human beings. But we can overcome this by rising above the narrow confines of Tony Abbott's to the broader concerns of all humanity and those of the desperate asylum seekers. Because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And as Martin Luther King puts it, he who passively accepts evil is much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. And in this civilized country like Australia, and in this democratic country, we can stamp out this inhumanity together. It's starting with me and you, because humanity indeed is measured by our attitude to the most at our mercy. Thank you very much.
Sally's been a supporter of refugee rights for a long time through both Labor and Liberal governments, so I'll hand it over to you.
Well, where is Tony Abbott? Not that we want to see him, because we're going to have to see a whole lot of him for the next few years, but during the election campaign we had weekly, daily, hourly repeating he's going to stop the boats all the time, over and over and over. And since the election, where is he? Nowhere to be seen, and as it's been said, 10 boats have arrived and he hasn't stopped the boats, and of course he's got this disgraceful policy of hiding the boats rather than so-called stopping the boats. And when we think about this, we should realise that this was a political strategy that he had not just to get elected, but to have vulnerable people fighting working Australians, to turn working Australians against vulnerable people. Because he knew every single time people started to think, why is my cost of living going up? Why can't I get a secure job? 30% of Australians are in secure work. Why is it so hard to buy a house in Sydney? Why is there so much traffic on the M4? It must be because of those refugees. And wherever he was able to succeed in this, wherever he was, he distracted from himself and the fact that he intends to take away our rights at work. He tends to take away our penalty rates. He tends to make insecure work even more insecure. He intends to get rid of our public services. And so while working people were worried about something that wasn't real, where people that more vulnerable than them were being blamed for the problems, he was let off the hook. And this was his political strategy. So for us, as refugee activists, we're going to have to be prepared for the worst time, because it's going to be much worse than it was under the Labor government, and this is partly the Labor Party's fault, that they agreed with the policies of the Liberal opposition at the time. And we took everyone to a lower benchmark that we are at the moment. So for us as refugee activists, we need to do two things. First of all, we need to unite around a solution. That solution first lies, I believe, in being able to explain to people that it is not refugees that are taking your jobs. It's Tony Abbott that's going to be taking your jobs. It's not refugees that are to blame for the fact of lack of public transport in Western Sydney. It's the O'Farrell government that's responsible for lack of public transport in Western Sydney. And it's only where we start putting it in that frame that people can see these strategies for what they are: a disgusting, cruel, inhumane, political strategy to turn people against each other, and we can rise up beyond the situation we're at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. Before we go on to the next speaker, I'm just going to announce some of the events that we've got coming up as well. We're going to go to Scott Morrison's office down in Cronulla. That's on the 19th of October at 12 p.m. And we're converging on Canberra in the 19th of November as well. So that's going to be a national convergence. There's information about these at the RAC stall just behind you. You can pick up a flyer. There's some information on the back about all the latest policy changes. And you can also put your name down to be involved with RAC in the future to help organise events like this. We're also going to start running some stalls and outreach events. We need people to come along and have conversations with people on the streets so that we can get this message out there. All right, next I'm going to invite, got your name, Joe Collins from the Australian West Papua Association up to the stage. Thank you.
Hi. Last week, 7 West Papuan asylum seekers, which are a smaller number compared to the hundreds that arrive from other parts of the world every week, but 7 arrived on the Australian island of Bogu in the Torres Strait Islands. They were interviewed for a couple of days. They were told they would be flown to the Australian mainland, but they were tricked by the immigration department and sent to PNG. Now, anybody that knows anything about the situation in West Papua would realise that they are genuine asylum seekers. They are fleeing persecution by the Indonesian security forces. And to touch briefly on the issue of West Papua, it's now 50 years since West Papua, the former colony of PNG, was handed over to Indonesian administration by the UN. And for 50 years, the oppression of the West Papuan people have continued. During the 1980s, the oppression was so bad, 10,000 West Papuans fled across the border into PNG, and they are still on the border areas of PNG. Now, it's highly unlikely that the 7 West Papuan recent asylum seekers sent to PNG would be handed back to Indonesian authorities. But the PNG government has signed an MOU with the Indonesian government, and the situation would have to be carefully monitored that they are not handed back. On the 1st of May this year, the West Papuan people had a peaceful demonstration. 3 of them were killed and hundreds arrested. And this should indicate to the Australian government that anybody fleeing from West Papua to Australia is a genuine asylum seeker. And the only answer is for Australia, all refugees should be welcome here. All refugees fleeing persecution, no matter where they are coming from in the world, should be welcomed in Australia and allowed to stay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe, for that perspective. All right, I'm going to hand over to our final speaker now. It's Dominique Sherab from the Refugee Action Coalition.
We now know that many people have drowned in their attempt to make it to Australia in recent days. It's a tragedy. I'm sure many of you have seen the video of the survivors on the Sydney Morning Herald page. It's quite heart-wrenching. The survivors said that of the 81 people on board, there are 24 remaining, which means that the current death toll of 24 is only going to increase as the search rescue continues. I want to send our deepest condolences from this rally to those people in Indonesia who have lost their loved ones. And as we well know, this is not an isolated incident. There have been over 1,000 deaths at sea, more than 1,000 lives lost trying to make it to this country, trying to seek safety and flee persecution. And what we have seen in the last couple of years when these tragedies occur is callous. Politicians cry crocodile tears at the same time that they strengthen their commitments to stopping the boats. Professor William Malley from the ANU got it right when he said, what politicians are really concerned about, what they're actually saying is go die somewhere else. The issue for the politicians is not the deaths, but the proximity to Australia. And to that we say shame. Perhaps more callous is the silence of this government. Abbott ran away from reporters yesterday so as not to break the scheduled media briefing on matters of border protection. And it was only last night that Scott Morrison, our immigration minister, finally issued a statement, but seemingly only in response to the survivors' claims that Australian authorities knew where they were and did nothing about it. What this clearly demonstrates is that the coalition government is not interested in saving lives at sea. They don't even pretend to make this claim. The name Operation Sovereign Borders says it all. Lives don't factor into the equation. Abbott's tough stance on border protection will have devastating effects on asylum seekers who do make it to Australia. Abbott has said, no one who comes to Australia by boat and is found to be a refugee will get permanent residency. At best, they will get a temporary protection visa. And as we heard from Shokafor, we know what the devastating consequences of this will be. But he's also said that these people who do arrive here will be sent within 48 hours to Papua New Guinea and Nauru. and they're never coming back, he says. And to that we say, no way. They will be staying in Australia with us where they belong. But actually, Abbott doesn't want it to get to this point. He doesn't want people to come to Australia. He's committed to turning the boats back, which he has told us time and time again. Even when the Indonesian government has indicated its strong rejection of this idea. Already in the past week, we've seen two instances of Australian vessels entering Indonesian waters to assist asylum seeker boats back to Indonesia. And we can only expect that this is going to happen again with this government. We have to be very clear. This is not a refugee policy. This is a policy about borders. It is about restricting and punishing those people who try to come to this country, despite the fact that there is no crime in seeking asylum, which of course we all know too well. What Abbott and Morrison of course don't care to consider is that the refugee issue is a global one. That these people who have no choice but to flee their homes. Because persecution, as Shakafa has told us, is not a choice. We know that you cannot ask for asylum from the government that is persecuting you. We know that of the more than 15 million refugees in the world, only 1% are resettled. We know the minuscule numbers of refugees that Australia accepts. We know because of all of these things that deterrence will never work. One of the refugees who was returned by the Australian authorities put it simply, if Tony Abbott doesn't want to accept us as a boat seeker, then just give us a visa. His comments reveal the stupidity and destruction of deterrence and shows that there is an alternative. There is an alternative. Abbott continues to pester us with the suggestion that there isn't. We absolutely have an alternative. We can create processing centres in Indonesia, in Malaysia, to fasten the pace that people can get to Australia so that they don't have to get on these leaking boats, so that people don't have to die at sea. There is an alternative. And so I put a question to you. What would happen if Jordan refused entry of the burgeoning Syrian refugees on the grounds of sovereignty? We would see a lot more bloodshed. So I suppose what I'm saying is that Operation Sovereign Borders only exacerbates the global refugee issue, and that is why we must stop it. My final point is this. We cannot wait until the next election to change this policy, precisely because this policy will destroy so many lives. We must send a clear, loud, and angry message to Abbott that stopping the boats is not the solution. People flee because they must. And so we say to him, let them land, let them stay. Refugees are welcome here.
Thank you, Dom. Thank you so much. Thank you for reminding us that does not have to be the complex policy issue that both of the major parties will make it out to be. There are humane options out there that bring us into line with our international obligations. We can put them into place and the sky will not fall in.
Lock up Abbott! Throw away the keys! We won't stop till we free the refugees! Lock up Abbott! Throw away the keys! We won't stop till we free the refugees! Lock up Abbott! Tony Abbott, fuck you! Refugees have rights too! Tony Abbott, fuck you! Refugees have rights too! Refugees are welcome here! Stand loud, stand clear! Refugees are welcome here! Stand loud, stand clear! Refugees are welcome here! Stand loud, stand clear! Hey Abbott, we're talking to you, not Manus Island, not Nauru. Hey Abbott, we're talking to you, not Manus Island, not Nauru. Hey Abbott, USA! Let them land, let them stay! Let them land, let them stay! Deaths at sea. 50 people have died in the last couple of days, more than 30 of them children. In 2001, 353 died on a boat called the Civex. And they died in 2001 for the same reason They died 2 days ago because we have got rotten Liberal politicians who are certain to implement temporary protection visas that give no other way for people to come from from Indonesia to Australia unless they get a boat. So we are here to tell them they are hypocrites, and we will continue to oppose temporary protection visas, continue to oppose offshore processing, continue to oppose the lack of legal aid and assistance for asylum seekers that come to Australia, and we are not going to stop till Tony Abbott is out of the Canberra, and we are not going to stop until we have got a humanitarian program. So just once more before we go, Tony Abbott, hear us say, let them land! Let them stay! Tony Abbott, hear us say, let them